What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I just want to talk a bit about American expansion, as that is sort of the focus of the end of our class, looking at how America moved westward. And it's sort of a journey up until 1890, when it was declared the West was won, expansion was done, the United States can be seen from one ocean to the other, with pushing out the Spanish, pushing out the French, but also pushing aside vast, numerous, and powerful native peoples of the Americas. And that story still continues, but the development of what we now see as the United States of America is that journey from basically 1800, the end of the Revolutionary War in the 1780s, up until 1890. It really shows expansion. And there's three directions you have to sort of look at and understand how this works early on. First, you have to understand one particular man, Thomas Jefferson, and his vision and direction and changes in this Republican nation in his Republican ideals. And remember, look at that in the textbook of how that differs to the Federalist views. And his idea, his sort of things that he focused on was both the dangers to the country being high population, high density, and social evils it generated. So he's looking at, as examples in Europe, that there's cities that have high concentration of people. This is a very famous painting by Hogarth. Really what he's talking about here is the sins of gin, the alcohol gin, and it's kind of split in two. Here's ale. So there's just problems with ale, but people are pretty social. People are a little handsy. But over here, they're throwing the baby over the thing, and this absolute chaos having to do all because of gin. But Jefferson saw something different here. He says the sins is not the alcohol, but it's the concentration, the density of people in cities. So his suggestion is to not have people concentrated in land, but having to have an agrarian lifestyle on one side. But also the concentration of money and power in the hands of few people is also a problem and also going to destroy the nation. So looking at both those two things, westward expansion was his highest agenda, and it remained the agenda of American building for the rest of the century, and arguably even to today. Even in Northern California, where Shasta College is located, you should be pretty aware, if you've driven on I-5, signs welcoming you to the Jefferson State. The Jefferson State and the ideals of the Jefferson being called the Jefferson State is because of the same value systems that Thomas Jefferson was looking at. He's looking for an agrarian sort of culture, looking at directions of a country and individuals with a life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, having their own land, agrarian lifestyle, taking it away from the power from a few into the hands of many for the most part, although that's arguable as well. And his idea of having small government, reducing the army size, abolishing taxes on, most popular, on whiskey, very popular if you remember the Whiskey Rebellion, and that it was a very small executive branch to really bring it down to the bare bones and to not have a strong federal government, but have strong state governments. His duties for him, in his mindset of a federal executive branch, was to maintain a strong postal service, maintaining federal courts, staffing lighthouses. And why is that important? Well, that's the whole movement of everything in and out of America to Europe and abroad, to China, to India as that starts to open up, the Mediterranean, all that. And they need to have safe international waters safety in the lighthouses, collecting customs duties, so getting the taxes, and conducting census every 10 years. That was, to him, the heart of the government. All the other stuff has to deal with the Congress, has to deal with the state rights, and it was his direction. So Jefferson's one important thing to look at in this chapter, and his motivations, and compare that to Jackson later on that we've already looked at. But in connection with Jefferson and his ideal of moving westward, expansion, opening up lands for agrarian new states to be formed, and collectively creating power in this country, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. If you look at this map, that doubles the size of the already existing United States, doubling it. But how does this happen? Well, to best understand American expansion in the early 1800s, you have to first go back to the end of the 7 Years' War. Remember that? Ending in 1763, and its essence, the First World War, the part of it being in North America known as the French and Indian War. Now, we've talked about that in detail and how that war and what led with high taxes and what led to promises unkept did lead to the Revolutionary War. But also, it helped change the proportions of this land that was going to become Louisiana Purchase, shifting hands from the losing French to Spain. Now, Spain got control of this territory, but they weren't doing a very good job of maintaining it. Pretty much they just were taxing it and letting it go to its own demise, letting the traders and the trappers and the French, as well as the native people who already are living there, have control of this region, they're certainly not knowing it's technically Spanish or French. It is their land, as it has been. But things start to change in 1800 with this guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. When he really gets control and starts to spread his might across Europe, he's also spreading his might across the Americas. And he's able to, with a secret deal, a secret little treaty, get back this territory lost to the Spanish. The Spanish give it back to Napoleon. But at the same time that these powers are trying to figure out what to do with this territory in North America, this small little island in the Caribbean, not called Saint Dominique, being the major producer of sugar, being a huge producer of coffee that the world is becoming more and more addicted to and demanding more supply of it, starts to revolt. Now, why do we care about this little tiny dinky little island right in the middle of the Caribbean and the expansion of America? Well, it really has a lot to do with it. It's this tiny little island, 8,000 plantations in this island, with 40% of the world's sugar coming out of it and half of the world's coffee. The population was mostly slaves, over 500,000 slaves on this island, with 40,000 whites. What you have in the late 1700s is this new direction of revolution. You have the American Revolution banking on these Enlightenment ideals that we had talked about before. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that's Enlightenment ideas from these Enlightenment thinkers. And same happens in France, but also on this tiny little island of Saint Dominique that created a mass slave revolt at the same time, around 1791. There was a bit of a miscommunication of the French Revolution, because in France, and remember, Saint Dominique is a territory of France, so they're calling for freedom and equality for everybody in France, and their battle cry, "Vive la France," and freedom for all. And they hear that, the slaves hear that, they think, hey, we're French, we're in French territory, that means freedom for us as well. And so in 1791, you get 500,000 slaves revolt, burning down thousands of 1,000 plantations, creating factions between each other, and starting to create absolute havoc. Their leader, Toussaint Louverture, meaning gap, or in French, and it's kind of because of his teeth. He had a big gap in front of his teeth, so his slave name, Louverture, but he took it and owned it and made it his name, and is forever famous as this island's freedom. I have undertaken vengeance. I want liberty and equality to reign in Saint Dominique. I am working to make that happen. Unite yourselves to us, brother, and fight it. with us for the same cause. It's a very revolutionary ideals. He's using the Enlightenment ideals of life and liberty and equality. And what happens in all is he's successful. And in 1804, the slaves successfully take over the island, renaming it to the indigenous name Haiti as we still know it today, and declaring all Haitians as black and all Haitians as equal, and destroying all plantations, essentially destroying the whole way of life. But remember, this is the way of life that's also thriving in the United States at this time, specifically in the South. We have slave plantations, over with more population of slaves than free whites, than rich whites, than plantation-owning whites. And this becomes a fear for the people in countries where slave was there. After the Revolutionary War in Haiti, there was hope for some that across the slave nations in America, both in North America and South America, songs were written from slaves about hope and how this was a remembrance of this. Think of Spartacus during Roman times, same sort of thing. But also a fear for others, for slave owners, to watch out and to not let them get you. The phrase of a zombie, it comes from a guy named Jean Zombie, who was one of the leaders of the revolt, and he went around carrying out the orders of killing all the white slave owners. And it became like the boogeyman of the time. Watch out, or the zombie will get you. And so the fear of slave uprisings becomes very real, but at the same time, it allows for Napoleon Bonaparte to break free from putting his efforts and energy into the Western Hemisphere. He has enough to deal with in expanding his empire in Europe. And so what you see is a change from his perspective of looking of expansion in the Western Hemisphere, focusing there. He happily sells the land, to the new and uprising little country, United States, therefore creating the Louisiana Purchase. But all of that wouldn't have happened if the Haitian Rebellion didn't happen, if Jefferson's ideals of westward expansion and agrarian reform was not there, and this forever changes the course of American history. From Louisiana Purchase, you get a new direction of Jeffersonian politics, looking in expansion, continental expansion across what is now the United States. So you get the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 after France decides to give it up, losing their biggest cash cow, the most important island in the Caribbean, and putting more resources into expansion in Europe. They see a great opportunity to get money, important money, to fund Napoleon's wars, but also United States sees opportunity to double the land size of the country. And Jefferson loves that. He's able to mount a federal treasury surplus, increase national income, expand the borders, doubling the border, and sending, as you read about, the famous Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, both clerks to the president himself, sending them out to expand, to explore, and see, and make relations with the people in this new territory. Very famously, and an important part of this, is Sacagawea, and as a person that goes with them, she speaks multiple languages. Her story is depicted in the reading, so please see her important role. But it's to also bridge and to understand, not to conquer the people of this territory. Jefferson, to be successful, has to ally with the powerful natives of these areas, which, if you're familiar with the old game Oregon Trail, this should look very familiar, because what they are marking out is the very route of which would become the Oregon Trail of westward expansion later in the later century. Now, Jefferson's small government was good for some, but an unfilled promise to most. Think of, for women, there was a lot of subjugation of women to men. African Americans still enslaved. Native Americans being pushed off their land, and yeoman craftsmen, small business owners, still trying to make a name for themselves. So that's something to look at in this reading, is how people are responding, how everybody in this country is responding. But Native Americans in Jefferson Republic, what he says is that if whites lift Indians out of their savagery and their uncivilized state, they will grow. He said that. He says that using Enlightenment ideas of certain taxonomies of individuals, this is where racism comes out of. But his view is that Native Americans are formed in mind as well as in body. They're good. And they're the same as the Homo sapiens europaeus. So back in those days, there was the Homo sapiens africanus, African Americans or Africans. There's Homo sapiens europaeus. There's Homo sapiens. There's different types. And that was to scientifically justify racism. Using the scientific justifications of racism, but he's saying Native Americans are the same. They are just culturally retarded, is what he would say. And so his idea, and this should look familiar from what you've looked at in these chapters, is that he's thinking, look, if we move these Native people out of their environment, specifically in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, specifically Cherokees, but many others as well, if we take them out, move them to this new territory, which is going to become Oklahoma and part of it, but in this Louisiana Purchase, move them out there and start to nurture them. Start to be like a father figure to them. And then we will allow them to grow and become civilized. On the other hand, you have people like Chief John Ross, the chief of the Cherokee Nation that you read about, that you saw in the documentary, creating a constitution for the Cherokee Nation, creating a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in English and with a written language of the Cherokee language, looking at how to not assimilate so much, but to synchronize two cultures together, a Cherokee and an American culture within the same territory. And so his constitution, though annulled when gold was found on the land, so Georgia annulled the Constitution and there are rights when gold was found there. But he did take his problems to the Supreme Court. And he won the case, if you remember right. He won the case that Indian justice in federal courts was upheld, but President Jackson at the time overruled it, vetoed it, and created the Indian Removal Act in 1830. In that Indian Removal Act, 100 million acres vacated for white settlements under the authority of ethnic expulsion of all Indians west of Mississippi, specifically to the Indian Territory. And this was not widely accepted. In fact, it was widely controversial by both government and public opinion in the newspapers. There was a bunch of cartoons kind of showing what was happening here. And one would think, as it was quoted, one would think the guilt of African slavery was enough for the nation to bear. Remember, millions of slaves, still slaves in this country in the 1830s, without the additional crime and injustices to the Indians. So you have two different stories. You have growth of the nation, but at the same time, at what cost? And as historians, we have to be understanding of both. It's not black or white, completely good, completely bad. There is a gray area, but we have to understand of what the horrors the country did to make sure we try not to go down the same route again, and at the same time understand the beauty of a country that was created, that was an idea to create men and women to become equal, and how to use that in this 21st century, understanding its past to not repeat it and to move forward in a more positive direction. So how do we reconcile with presidents and people of our past, our founding fathers, who on one side would say African Americans are inferior to whites, though having an affair with his slave, selling hemming, having problems with African American mathematicians like Benjamin Banker, who he said, this mathematician, astronomer, he said there's no way he came up with these ideas himself. He must have had help from a white person. At the same time, talking about Native Americans, himself and Andrew Jackson, talking about how They're the great father to these inferior, unhappy race. How do we reconcile and understand these individuals? Are they just products of their time? Or is this something that we need to understand in the deep-rooted nature of the country? It's up to you to decide. But to understand the past, to not destroy it, to not silence it, whether it's good or bad, we need to remember all of this and understand the diversity of the story of the American growth of this country.